Welcome to Midnight Casebook, where every shadow hides a secret and every mystery begs to be solved. Tonight, we unravel the chilling tale of Father Brown and the rain that stayed too long, a fan-made story paying homage to the brilliance of G.K. Chesterton's legendary detective. We'd love to have you along for this enigmatic journey. Drop a comment to let us know where you're watching from, share your theories, and if you spot any inconsistencies, don't hesitate to call them out. Your keen eyes and sharp minds help us craft even more captivating mysteries in the future. Chapter 1. When Rain Covered a Murder. The dead girl was still smiling when they dragged her body from the well, her eyes wide open as if she'd seen the face of the killer and decided to take the secret to the grave. It wasn't just the corpse that chilled the blood, it was the rain, unrelenting for 5 days straight, as though the sky itself wanted to wash away what happened in the village of Elmridge. No one spoke aloud what they suspected, but everyone knew. The storm hadn't just brought water, it had brought death. Father Brown arrived on the 6th day, his black umbrella too small for the torrent, his cassock soaked, and his eyes sharper than the cold wind whistling between the hedgerows. He didn't ask questions at first. He listened. That was worse, because when Father Brown listened, things started to shift. People began to falter. Secrets forgot how to hide. The girl's name was Ruth Ellaby, 17, quiet, a maid at the vicarage until 2 weeks ago when she disappeared without a trace, until the rain overflowed the well, and she rose like something returned from the deep. Her hands were folded neatly, as though someone had prayed over her after laying her down. Her lips parted in what the village children called the ghost smile. It would have been less terrifying had her wrists not been tied behind her back. Father Brown stood at the edge of the well, staring down into the water, still stained, faintly red, and muttered a phrase no one quite caught. Some swore it sounded like, "God didn't see this." Others thought he said, "She saw God before dying." No one asked for clarification. You didn't ask Father Brown to repeat himself when his face turned like that, tight, pale, and unreadable. By noon, the whispers had begun, that Ruth was pregnant, that she'd threatened someone, that the baby was the son of someone important. No proof, of course, just fear disguised as gossip. But even fear leaves fingerprints, and Father Brown was collecting them like rosary beads. He visited the vicar first, Reverend Samuel, who had hired Ruth. She left without notice, the Reverend said too quickly. Young girls are impulsive. They run off. His wife, seated behind him, flinched. A tremor, no more than a twitch in her left eye. Father Brown watched. She was not the impulsive kind, he said softly. She stayed to clean the linens, even on Sundays. The Reverend didn't reply. He just stared at the fire and for a flicker of a moment looked almost afraid. It wasn't just the vicarage. Father Brown walked to the schoolhouse where Ruth had once studied. The schoolmaster, Mr. Pell, took off his glasses when he saw the priest and spoke with the tired honesty of someone who wanted to confess but didn't know how. She was bright, too bright. She asked questions the other girls never asked. He looked at the rain sliding down the glass. About sin, about silence. Silence. That word would come back, again and again. People described Ruth as quiet, but it wasn't the kind of quiet that kept peace. It was the kind that echoed, the kind that listens more than it speaks and remembers everything. By the time night fell, Father Brown had walked the length of Elmridge twice. He stopped at a barn just outside the village where someone had drawn a symbol in the dirt, a spiral with a line through it. It had rained since, but Father Brown could still see the imprint, faint but deliberate. The symbol meant nothing to the average passerby, but to someone who'd studied theology, folklore, and the darker practices that sometimes infected small minds in small places, it was unmistakable, a mark of secrecy, a pledge of silence, and a warning. The next morning, a second body was found. Not a girl this time. A man, William Carter, the well-keeper, face down in the mud behind his cottage, head split open like an egg. The police claimed he'd slipped in the storm, but Father Brown, standing over the body, shook his head. "Too clean," he murmured, "too quiet for a fall." And he pointed out the single boot print near the corpse, small, narrow, likely a woman's. The villagers began to panic, but it wasn't the deaths that frightened them. It was the idea that someone among them wasn't who they claimed to be, that someone knew too much, and that someone was willing to kill again to keep what they knew from crawling into the light. Father Brown returned to the vicarage the next evening. He stood in the doorway, rain steaming off his shoulders, and said, "Reverend, who knew Ruth's real father?" The Reverend went pale. His wife dropped her teacup. The crash didn't matter. The silence that followed did. "She told you," the Reverend whispered. "She told the well," Father Brown replied. "And now the well has spoken back." The Reverend closed the door, but it was too late. Something in that moment cracked open. The truth hadn't been revealed, but it had taken form, shifting in the shadows like a serpent ready to strike. But even as pieces surfaced, none of them fit. Why would Ruth be tied up if her death was accidental? Why bury her in the well unless someone believed no one would ever find her? And what of the rain, so constant, so unnatural, that it made the villagers believe they were cursed? Father Brown found himself walking to Ruth's old room, long since locked. He requested the key from the Reverend's wife. She said she'd lost it, but when she turned away, Father Brown reached into the flower vase on the hallway table. The key was there, dust-covered, waiting. Inside the room, everything was untouched, but not unmarked. Beneath the bed, a book, a journal. Ruth's handwriting, sharp, careful, angry. Pages filled with names, times, glances exchanged. Her last entry was dated 3 days before she vanished. He said, "I know nothing, but I know enough. Enough to keep him from the altar." The altar. Father Brown turned pale. Not 20 minutes later, he arrived at the church. It was dark, empty, but the sanctuary always held echoes. He stood near the pulpit and whispered, "You confessed to her, didn't you?" The stillness answered back, but not out of guilt, out of fear. Then something moved behind the curtain, but no one came forward. Only a draft, only a breath, only the smell of smoke. Someone had set fire to Ruth's journal. Back at the vicarage, a drawer now sat open, scorched. The journal half burnt inside, as if someone had tried to destroy it, but changed their mind at the last second, or couldn't go through with it. Father Brown retrieved what pages he could. The final one, barely legible, read, "He says God sees all, but he doesn't want God to see this. No name, no date, no direct accusation." But Father Brown didn't need more. He went back to the well that night, rain still falling like needles. He stood there for a long time, as though speaking to Ruth beneath the soil. "I know who did it," he said at last, "but the truth will never be told, because what's buried beneath this rain isn't just you, it's what you knew. And if that truth rises, it won't stop with your killer. It will drown this entire village. The next morning, the rain stopped, and no one ever spoke of Ruth again, not because they forgot her, but because the moment they did, the rain might return, and with it, the voice from the well. Chapter 2. Father Brown knew too late. He should have arrived an hour earlier, before the girls swallowed the poison, before the final candle burned itself out, before the note vanished. But Father Brown, who saw what others never did, only stepped through the door when the silence had already become permanent. It wasn't just death that greeted him. It was the soundless scream left hanging in the air, as if the soul itself had tried to warn him but failed by seconds. And in that moment, even the rain outside seemed to hesitate. The house on Magpie Hill was older than memory, with its windows nailed shut and ivy that grew like veins up the stone. The villagers avoided it, not because it was haunted, but because something far worse lingered inside, something human. Eleanor Darrington lived there alone since her father's death. Some whispered madness, others whispered secrets, but no one ever told Father Brown what they truly feared, that Eleanor had begun speaking to the dead. And the dead, it seemed, had answered. Father Brown had received the letter that morning, unsigned, untraceable, and written in a hand trembling so violently the ink bled between lines. Come now, she knows she's not safe. That was all. No return address, no explanation. Just dread in handwriting. He arrived too late. Eleanor lay on the parlor floor, her eyes wide open and fixed on the ceiling, as if she was still waiting for someone to arrive and tell her she'd made a mistake. The teacup beside her was shattered. The air smelled faintly of almonds, but it wasn't the poison that chilled Father Brown. It was the photograph clutched in her left hand. It showed 5 people. 4 of them were dead. There had been an accident 3 years prior. A carriage overturned in the marshlands, killing a family of 4 on the spot. Everyone believed it had been a freak storm, but Eleanor, as Father Brown would soon learn, never believed in storms that targeted sinners. The 5th person in the photo, her younger brother Isaac, had vanished after the crash. No body, no note, no answers, until now, because scrawled on the back of the photo, in fresh ink, were the words, "He's not gone, he never was." Father Brown searched the house methodically. The furniture had not been dusted in weeks. The mirrors were all covered in black cloth. In the upstairs room, once Isaac's, the wallpaper had been slashed with a blade in long, vertical gashes, as though someone were trying to carve something out of the wall that no longer existed. There was no sign of forced entry, no second teacup, no bottle. And yet, the back door was unlocked. Unusual, Eleanor had been paranoid about security. Every drawer in the study was open, every envelope scattered. But one envelope was missing, a 6th envelope, based on the indentations in the filing box, and whatever was in it, Eleanor had died for it. The police declared it suicide. Father Brown did not argue, but as he walked back to the church, rain beginning to fall, in soft sheets over the cobblestone, something gnawed at him, an unease not born of guilt, but recognition. Someone had wanted him there, but not to save Eleanor. Someone wanted him to find her. Too late. He revisited the family archive the next morning, dusty and sealed away in the village records vault. There he found the Darrington family estate logs, and among them, a document notarized a month before the fatal carriage accident. A will, altered. All properties and assets, formerly to be split between Eleanor and Isaac, had been redirected solely to Eleanor, under the condition of Isaac's incapacity. The word itself had been added in a different pen. A Hamasit Vani, sloppy, but effective. Enough to raise suspicion, enough to make someone vanish. It was never an accident, and suddenly, everything Eleanor had feared made sense. She had uncovered the lie. She had found the missing ink in a forged document, and it had cost her the one thing that couldn't be changed, her life. But what still made no sense was the letter sent to Father Brown. "She's not safe." That voice hadn't been Eleanor's. It had been Isaac's. That meant he was alive, somewhere close, somewhere watching, and perhaps punishing. That night, Father Brown received another letter, this time slipped under his door. Same trembling hand. "Look beneath the old chapel. The family vault hides sins the Lord himself turned from." There was no old chapel, not anymore. It had been burned down a decade ago and left in ruin, blackened stone and shattered pews, but the vaults beneath were still intact. Father Brown entered them by lantern. Dust curled like smoke in the silence, rats scattered. He descended alone. The family tombstones were intact, names engraved in solemn order. The Darrington line from 1745 onward, all marked and sealed, except one, Isaac's. It was there, a stone carved with his name, despite no body ever being recovered, and beneath it, fresh soil, not fresh in years, fresh in days. He knelt, touched the dirt, and stopped breathing. The earth was soft, recently disturbed. He pressed his hand deeper and touched something hard, wood. But when he lifted the loose plank, he did not find a body. He found a box. Inside, a rosary, a lock of Eleanor's hair, and a letter, the same handwriting. But the content this time? "I was alive until she killed me. Now I return to claim what's mine. And she tried to stop me. So I stopped her first." It made no sense. Isaac was alive, but claiming to be dead? Or had someone else written it, using his name to cloak the crime in madness? Father Brown's head spun. Each truth contradicted the next, and every answer only sharpened the blade of confusion. He returned to the parlor where Eleanor had died, and that's when he saw it. The mirror across from the fireplace, still covered. He pulled the cloth away, and he saw not his reflection, but a message, written in condensation from behind the glass. "You never looked behind you." He turned. A shadow moved, and then it was gone. The police dismissed it as imagination. But Father Brown knew what he'd seen wasn't the devil. It was worse. It was someone human, someone clever, and someone who had waited years for this moment, knowing exactly when to strike, not when Eleanor was most alone, but when someone would come to try and save her. Too late, and now the silence had spread. Father Brown walked into the rain, whispering to no one in particular, "I know who did it, but the truth will bury the living." Chapter 3. The confession rain tried drowning. The body hadn't spoken in 2 days, but its final words were still leaking through the church roof with every drop of rain, and Father Brown, soaked to the bone and standing alone at the altar, realized too late that someone had tried to drown not just a man, but the truth. He died to speak. It wasn't the murder that disturbed him most. It was the look on the victim's face, a kind of peace that doesn't come from forgiveness, but from betrayal, finally, fulfilled. They found Daniel Cryer slumped against the steps of St. Jude's Chapel, his mouth pressed to the wood like he'd tried to whisper his sins into the very bones of the church. A carpenter's chisel was buried clean through his left eye, and the rain had washed away most of the blood before anyone noticed the stain wasn't from the roof leak. The local constable called it a break-in gone wrong. Father Brown called it something else. Confession interrupted. What unsettled him most wasn't the violence. It was the fact that Daniel had never once attended Mass. Not in all his 39 years. Not even on the day his wife was buried. He wasn't the sort of man to die in front of an altar, which meant something had changed, something urgent enough to make him run through the storm at midnight, leave his front door open, his coat still hanging by the hearth, and most chilling of all, in his hand was a waterlogged note, scrawled in a shaky red pencil. "Forgive me, Father. I saw her fall, but I didn't push her." Her, not named, not explained, but someone Daniel had carried in silence. And now, that silence had gotten him killed. The village of Grey Hollow wasn't a place where confessions came easy. It was the sort of place where secrets grew thicker than moss and twice as hard to peel back. Everyone knew everyone, but no one really knew anything. Or perhaps they simply pretended not to. Father Brown had long learned that the greatest lies were told not with words, but with glances, with lowered eyes and paused sentences. He began, as always, by listening. Daniel's widow, Marion, received him with dry eyes and trembling hands. She hadn't known where he'd gone that night. She thought he was asleep beside her, right until she woke to an empty bed and the front gates swinging wide. But there was something brittle in her voice, like she was holding something in too tightly. Daniel had nightmares, she said, always about the lake. Lake Haven stood just past the chapel, murky and black, with cattails that hummed in the wind and water that never quite reflected the sky. It was the site of an accident years ago. A young girl, maybe 13, slipped during a rainstorm and vanished beneath the surface before anyone could scream. Her body was never recovered. Some said she'd been taken by the current. Others whispered her father had pushed her in and claimed it was an accident. That father was Daniel Cryer. But no charges were ever filed. No witness. No evidence. Just grief and speculation. Now, years later, Daniel had turned up dead with the phrase, "I saw her fall," clawed into paper like he'd been trying to claw it out of his soul. Not my daughter, not Emma, just her. And Father Brown knew then that guilt doesn't always confess in order. It reveals itself backwards, tangled, messy, terrified. He went to the lake the next morning. It was still raining. It hadn't stopped since Daniel died, as though the heavens themselves were trying to keep the truth buried beneath mud and weeds. But something caught his eye at the shoreline, half-sunken, wrapped in reeds. A tin box. Inside were two items, a child's hair ribbon, stained brown from age, and a photograph. 3 children, 1 girl, 2 boys, standing on the edge of a wooden dock, Emma Cryer, and 2 neighbor boys, Patrick Thorne and Elliot Marsh, the same boys who, today, were respected men in Grey Hollow. Patrick ran the general store. Elliot taught Sunday school. Neither had ever mentioned being there that day. In fact, both had claimed they'd been out of town when the drowning occurred. But the photograph didn't lie. Father Brown confronted Patrick first. The man paled instantly, dropping a sack of flour that exploded across the floor, like smoke. "It was an accident," he said, before being asked. "We didn't mean for her to fall." And then, as if realizing the slip, he froze. "I mean, I wasn't there." Father Brown's silence was more accusatory than any word. He simply held up the photo. Patrick broke, not entirely, but enough. "It wasn't Daniel," he said, voice hoarse. "It was Elliot. He dared her to walk the edge of the dock, said he'd give her a shilling. She was just a girl, we all were. But when she slipped, he ran. He said, we'd all be blamed. And Daniel? Father Brown asked. He wasn't even there. He found us after, covered in mud, screaming. He thought we'd seen her drown, that it was our fault. He swore us to silence, but he never knew the truth, not the whole truth, which meant Daniel had carried guilt that never belonged to him, and someone had made sure he died believing it. That night, Father Brown returned to the chapel. The rain had softened into a hiss. He stood at the altar, staring at the dried blood in the grain of the wood, and whispered, "You died for a lie." Behind him, a shadow moved. It was Elliot Marsh. He stood in the doorway, soaked and shivering, face ashen. "You shouldn't dig," he said softly. "This place has been at peace for years." Father Brown didn't turn. Peace built on silence is just murder delayed. Elliot stepped forward. He was going to tell. "Daniel, he came to me before he went to you. Said he'd finally figured it out. That Emma hadn't just slipped, that someone had dared her. He remembered the coin, the dare." My face. Father Brown turned now. "So you killed him?" Elliot's face twisted. "No," he whispered. "I only followed him. I wanted to make sure he didn't twist the story. But when I got there, he was already on the steps. He saw me, and he smiled, like he wanted me to see, like he knew. I'd carry it now." He stepped closer. "I didn't kill him, Father, but I didn't save him either." Father Brown stared at the man. Then whose hand held the chisel? Elliot said nothing, because he didn't know, or worse, because he did, and couldn't bear the answer. Later, alone in the confessional, Father Brown read one final letter. It had been left behind, in the tin box, wedged beneath the ribbon. Daniel's handwriting. "I remember her laugh. I remember the coin. I remember the dare. But what I never remembered until now was the voice, the one that whispered, 'Let her fall.' I thought it was Elliot's, but now I fear it was mine." And so the question hung like fog in the chapel rafters. Was Daniel guilty of killing his daughter, or only guilty of believing he was? Was Elliot lying, or simply haunted? And who killed Daniel Cryer? Father Brown folded the letter slowly, eyes closed. "I know who did it," he said into the quiet, "but the truth will never be told." Outside, the rain finally stopped, but the confession, buried in thunder and silence, still echoed. Chapter 4. Murder slept beneath that rain. The scream was never heard because the thunder swallowed it whole, and by the time the villagers found the body, the rain had already been sleeping beside it for hours, like a lover trying to keep the crime warm. Even the coroner, after examining the scene, muttered only one thing under his breath. This body didn't die alone. Something else died with it. It was that sentence, overheard by Father Brown as he arrived at the edge of the marsh, that made him pause, because he had seen faces of murder before, but never one that looked peaceful. Margaret Temple was found half buried in the mud behind Wetherby Manor, her fingers still curled, as if she were clutching something invisible, her eyes open to the sky, like she was waiting for the clouds to close over her. It wasn't the kind of death that shocked a village like Wetherby. It was the kind that confused it. Margaret wasn't beloved. She was feared. The housekeeper of the manor, for nearly 2 decades, she'd kept more secrets than she ever cleaned. She'd been blackmailing someone. That much was certain. The question, however, was how many people she'd been blackmailing, and which one finally snapped. Father Brown arrived just after sunrise, soaked to the skin and strangely quiet. He didn't kneel at the body. He didn't speak to the constable. He walked straight into the manor as though he already knew where the storm had started. The first place he stopped was the library. Margaret's ledgers sat on the shelf, untouched except for one. Volume 12, the only one missing, the one dated for the last 3 months. But what caught Father Brown's attention wasn't the missing ledger. It was the fireplace, a faint trace of ash, too fine for wood, and a smell. Burned leather. Someone had tried to destroy something fast, late, and under pressure, and not well enough, because in the ashes he found part of a clasp, brass, ornate, the kind used to bind personal diaries. It wasn't long before suspicion twisted its way through the manor halls. Lady Catherine Weatherby claimed she hadn't spoken to Margaret in days, but her eyes flinched when Father Brown mentioned the library. Her son Henry swore he'd been in London the previous night, but his boots were lined with fresh Weatherby mud, and the maid, Lucy, said she heard nothing all night. But her bedsheets were still damp from a window she'd left open, conveniently open, just above the path where Margaret's body was found. There were too many lies, too many layers. But the strangest thing of all, Margaret had tried to tell someone. She'd written a letter, not addressed, not signed, found beneath her pillow, wrapped in oilcloth to keep it dry. Only 4 words, scribbled like a final breath. It wasn't an accident. But the real question was, what wasn't an accident? Father Brown returned to the marsh that afternoon, pacing in silence, listening to the wind. He followed the indentations in the mud, shallow but purposeful, not from boots, from wheels, a wheelchair, and suddenly the mystery fractured. Lady Catherine's father, Colonel Weatherby, hadn't spoken a word in 3 years. Paralysis. Some said stroke, others said something darker. But now, as Father Brown stared at the trail, wheels leading from the manor to the marsh and back again, he saw something no one else wanted to believe. The colonel had moved, or been moved. He went to the colonel's room at dusk. The old man sat upright, eyes blank, drool at the corner of his mouth. But on the windowsill, behind the curtain, lay something that shouldn't have been there. A dried white lily, the kind only found by the marsh, freshly cut just days ago. And stuck beneath the flower was a torn piece of a ledger, volume 12. One line, mostly burned away. "We'll tell the colonel everything if..." The rest was ash. But it was enough. Father Brown knew then that Margaret hadn't been blackmailing one person. She'd been blackmailing 3. Lady Catherine, her son Henry, and Lucy, the maid. But the person she'd confessed to, the person who had known everything, was the colonel, and someone had feared he might finally speak. The first big reveal came not in a scream, but a whisper. Lucy, frantic and pale, found Father Brown that night and pressed a photograph into his hand. "I can't sleep," she said. "I see her every time it rains." The photo was old, years old, of Margaret standing beside a young man. Not Henry, not anyone the villagers would recognize, but the name on the back was clear. Edward. Lucy trembled. Her son. He died here. Fell from the balcony during a thunderstorm. They said it was an accident, but Margaret, she always said someone pushed him. That was the accident Margaret had mentioned, the one she'd never forgiven, the one she was ready to expose. Edward's death had been buried not just in mud, but in silence, and now the silence had cracked wide open. Father Brown stood beneath the rain, staring at the balcony above the east. Wing, wing, the same one Margaret's son had fallen from. The railing had long since been repaired, but the ivy that grew there still bore a scar, where the wood had splintered from a fall. Someone had stood here once, angry, afraid. Someone who watched a boy fall and said nothing. The final piece fell into place when Father Brown walked into the drawing room and heard Henry arguing with his mother. Their voices were hushed, but not enough. "You said it was over," Henry hissed. "You said she'd never bring it up again." Lady Catherine's reply was colder than rain. "I said I'd take care of it, and I did." The silence that followed was suffocating, and then Father Brown entered. "I know who did it," he said. They froze, but he didn't name names. He simply looked at the fire and let the quiet burn longer than the flames. Because the truth didn't need to be shouted. It only needed to be known. Outside, the rain stopped, but inside Wetherby Manor, the storm had just begun. Chapter 5. She died when rain stopped. The first time anyone heard her scream was the exact moment the rain stopped, almost as if the storm had been shielding her from something worse, something human. They found her on the garden path, soaked to the skin, but already cold, her eyes wide open toward the grey, clearing sky, like she'd waited for the silence just long enough to die in it. There was no blood, no visible wound, and no sign of a struggle. But something in her face was twisted, not in pain, but in realization, as if whatever she saw in her final seconds was so unbearable, her heart refused to go on. Her name was Vivian Harper, 27, music teacher, lived alone in the gardener's cottage on the edge of Bishop's Rise. A quiet woman, too quiet, the kind the village never really noticed until she was dead. The coroner called it a natural death, sudden heart failure. But Father Brown stood over her body beneath the clearing clouds and whispered, "No heart fails that quietly, unless someone else told it to stop." That was the moment he knew. Vivian hadn't died of fear. She'd died of knowing. It began, as most horrors do, in whispers. The village of Bishop's Rise had not had a death in months, let alone one that stirred the air like this. Vivian had no known enemies, no debts, no family. But she'd kept a journal, found tucked beneath her pillow, and that journal contained names of children, dates, fragments of conversations, and above all, one repeated phrase that chilled Father Brown to his core. "He only visits when the rain falls." The local constable dismissed it as delusion. She was isolated, he said. People like that start imagining things. But Father Brown had seen imagined things before. They didn't leave footprints. There had been someone else, someone who visited the cottage regularly, only during storms. The neighbor, Mrs. Hemmings, spoke nervously about a man in a dark coat, never seen clearly. She swore he came through the woods, not the road. Swore she saw him only once. And after that, Vivian started locking her windows, even in the heat. He never came when the sun was shining, she said. But when the rain started, so did her music. The music, that was the next clue. Father Brown visited the cottage the next evening, after the wind had dried the walls. Inside was silence, so complete it ached. But the piano in the corner was still warm to the touch. And on the keys, someone had left a single fingerprint in soot. Not ash soot, as if they'd come straight from a fire and pressed one key before vanishing into the storm. C sharp. When he played it, the sound rang too sharp for the room. And then something else happened. A draft cold and sudden, lifted a curtain, and behind it, tucked in the window frame, was a letter, unopened, unsent, addressed not to anyone, but titled only, "If I Vanish." Father Brown read it by candlelight. Vivian wrote about a dream, or what she called a memory wrapped in fog. She described waking up in the middle of the night and seeing someone standing by her bed, always wet, always silent. He would not speak, but she knew who he was, because years ago, when she was a child, she saw that same face at her school. He had been a teacher once, not to her, but to a girl who drowned. The girl's name was Agnes, 11 years old, died on a field trip during a sudden storm, declared an accident, slipped by the riverbank, body never recovered. The teacher, gone the next day. That teacher had never been named publicly, but Vivian knew his face because she had seen it again, in her dreams, and recently in the reflection of her window when the rain blurred everything else. Father Brown went to the school archives. Most records were gone, but there was one mention of a temporary hire, Mr. A. Dalcombe, brought in for a single term, dismissed quietly after the girl's death. No photo, no address, just a single note in the headmistress's handwriting. Conduct raised concern. Recommend no further employment. But Dalcombe had vanished, or perhaps waited. That night, the rain returned, and with it, the figure. Father Brown sat in the cottage, lights off, waiting. Midnight came, the rain softened the roof, wrapped the house in white noise, and then a shadow moved past the window. Slow, confident, unhurried. The door creaked, not open, just flexed. He stood and stepped outside. There was no one there, but on the doorstep, an envelope. Inside, a photograph, old, grainy, a young man, smiling beside Agnes, and in the background, Vivian, aged just 6, watching from the corner of the frame. She'd seen it all. She'd just never remembered until it was too late. Or perhaps someone helped her forget, until the rain brought it back. The next morning, the piano was gone, dragged from the cottage entirely, but no one saw who took it. No neighbors, no witnesses, only tracks in the mud, leading into the woods, and ending at the old train tunnel, abandoned since 1911. Inside, Father Brown found the piano, smashed, and beside it, a small child's shoe, too small for Vivienne, too old to belong to anyone still living. He returned to the village and asked the question no one wanted to hear. What if the storm didn't bring death? What if it woke it up? There was no answer, only the sound of thunder building again. That night, he stood at Vivian's grave. Rain began to fall once more, and he whispered to the stone, "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told, because in Bishop's Rise, the dead sleep through sunshine, but when the rain stops, they remember." Chapter 6. A corpse waited in rain. The body had been sitting upright in the churchyard for nearly 6 hours before anyone noticed it hadn't moved. And by the time Father Brown touched its shoulder, the rain had already soaked through the clothes, the skin, the bones, as if the corpse had been patiently waiting for someone to confess to it. But no one had come. No one ever did, because the face on the dead man was smiling, not in peace, but in victory. They called him Thomas Merton. A drifter, they said, a stranger who'd arrived 3 days before the rains began and checked into the old boarding house on Mill Street. He was quiet, polite, paid in advance, and then he was dead, sitting on the church bench in the storm, hat in his lap, neck broken so cleanly it looked like he'd fallen asleep too fast. No struggle, no scream, just death wrapped in patience. Father Brown knew the difference between accidents and arrangements, and this was no accident. The body had been posed deliberately, knees folded, hands resting on a Bible, one borrowed from the pews inside. But the most disturbing part wasn't how he died. It was what lay tucked between the pages of that Bible. A photograph, old, torn, burnt at the edges. 3 people, a girl, a man, and someone with the face scraped off. No names, no date. But on the back, written in block capitals, were 5 words. You forgot what you did. The rain had started the moment Merton arrived in town, and hadn't stopped since. It had turned roads to rivers and gutters to graves. No one had seen him argue, fight, or even raise his voice. He'd walked to the church each morning, sat quietly, spoke to no one. But now, with his corpse perfectly arranged on sacred ground, the town was no longer calm, because someone had killed a man who barely existed. The local police asked the usual questions. No witnesses, no weapon, no motive. The medical examiner claimed the neck was snapped with surgical precision, not a fall. But no one saw anyone enter the yard, and no one saw anyone leave, except Father Brown. He had seen a shadow the night before, moving under the arch near the chapel crypts, too fast to identify, but not fast enough to go unnoticed. And as he walked past the rain-slicked tombstones, he saw something else. A candle stub, freshly burned, hidden behind the angel's statue on the gravesite of Beatrice Langdon. Beatrice had died 7 years ago, drowned during a thunderstorm. Official story, accident, but Father Brown had officiated her funeral. He remembered how her father wouldn't meet anyone's eyes. He remembered how the boy who loved her had vanished the following week. He remembered the silence, and now the rain had brought someone back to disturb the dead. He went to the boarding house. Merton's room was spotless, too spotless. No luggage, no books, no past, except one item taped to the underside of the mattress. A torn letter, unsigned, almost unreadable from water damage, but 5 words, survived. I saw her that night. The next step was the Langdon estate. Old money, older secrets. Beatrice's mother had died of grief. Her father, William Langdon, now reclusive and nearly blind, hadn't stepped outside in 2 years. But when Father Brown entered the study, the old man said something strange. I knew it wouldn't end in the water. Father Brown didn't reply. He waited. Langdon spoke again. Thomas Merton, that's not his real name. I saw his eyes once. Same eyes as the boy, the one who vanished. He came back. To tell. To tell what? Father Brown asked. But the old man only smiled and wept. The pieces began to fall out of order. If Merton had been the boy who disappeared after Beatrice's death, why return now? Why fake a name? Why arrange his own death like a warning? Unless it wasn't his warning, but someone else's confession. That night, the storm worsened. Father Brown returned to the churchyard. The corpse had been moved, finally claimed by the coroner, but the bench remained wet, slick with rain, and in the grass below, a pendant, small, rusted, the initials BL on the back. It had not been there earlier, and it had not been missed. Someone had returned to leave it. He waited in the darkness, and just before dawn, the figure came back. A young woman, hooded, dripping. She knelt at the bench, whispering to the air. Father Brown stepped forward. Why now? He asked. She didn't scream. She looked up slowly and said, because I loved him once. And then I lied. Her name was Clara Shaw. childhood friend of Beatrice. She had been there the night Beatrice drowned. She had seen the fight between Beatrice and the boy. Marcus, not Thomas, the real name at last. He didn't push her, Clara said. She ran, slipped. But I told them it was him, because I wanted him gone. She looked at the bench. He came back, changed his name, said he forgave me. Then he died in front of the place where she's buried. Father Brown was quiet for a long time. Then he asked, "But who killed him?" Clara blinked. I thought he took his own life." Father Brown shook his head. "No one breaks their own neck that cleanly." And then they both understood. Someone else knew the truth. Someone who never forgot the lie. The next morning, a second body was found. Clara. Same posture, same Bible, same bench, same rain. But this time, no photo. Just one line etched into the mud with a finger. Forgiveness never came. Father Brown stood beneath the storm, watching the rain flood the grave of Beatrice Langdon. He whispered, "I know who did it." And then he looked at the manor on the hill. But the truth will never be told. Chapter 7. The rain whispered her killer. The strangest thing about the night she died wasn't the way her body was found, or even the slit across her throat. It was the way the rain seemed to say her name over and over, like the sky itself had seen the murder and couldn't bear to keep it secret. People say the dead can't speak, but that storm whispered something no one could unhear. And once Father Brown listened closely enough, it whispered back a name. Her name was Evelyn Mallory, 34, a writer of children's stories, with a quiet voice and eyes that always looked a little too far beyond whoever she was speaking to. She lived at the edge of Thorncross Village, in a stone cottage, half swallowed by ivy and memory. People described her as kind but distant, private but polite. She'd lost her sister years ago in what was officially declared a drowning. But Father Brown had always found the details too quiet, too clean. Evelyn never talked about it. She just wrote her books and lit a candle every year on the same day, always just before the autumn rains returned. It was raining the night Evelyn died, a violent, punishing storm that struck just past midnight. By morning, the constable was at the cottage, Father Brown trailing behind, his boots already soaked through with the weight of suspicion. Evelyn's body lay just inside her writing room, one hand still clutching a wet manuscript, the ink running like blood across the pages. There were no signs of forced entry, nothing stolen, no evidence of a struggle. Only the window cracked open, odd considering the storm, and the floor damp with a single trail of muddy footprints. One set, leading in, but not out. The manuscript she held contained a story not yet published, a fable, seemingly. But the more Father Brown read, the more he realized it wasn't a tale. It was a confession in disguise, a story about two sisters, one who swam too far, and the other who watched her drown. A story where the water kept secrets that didn't stay buried, and a line scribbled in the margins that chilled him completely. She called my name before the water took her. Father Brown closed the manuscript and looked at Evelyn's hand, cold, but not clenched, as if in the end she hadn't fought, as if she'd finally surrendered to something long overdue. The path to this moment hadn't begun last night. It had started years ago with the sister, Emily, 15 when she died, fell into the river after slipping on moss-covered rocks. At least that's what the village believed. Evelyn had never spoken about it, but she'd written instead, page after page, and Father Brown had read enough to know when fiction is simply truth wearing a mask. He visited the riverbank where Emily drowned. The rocks were still there, jagged and mossy, but something else caught his eye. A tree, newly carved, a name etched deep into the bark, E. Mallory. But not just one. Two, side by side, as if someone had stood there recently, remembering, or preparing. Back at the cottage, he found Evelyn's neighbor, Mr. Trent, leaning against the gate, a retired teacher, sharp-eyed and quietly watchful. "I saw someone that night," he said. "Didn't get a good look, but they walked with a limp, slow, deliberate. Didn't belong in the storm." A limp? There was only one man in Thorncross known for that. Miles Gresham, former groundskeeper, once employed at the Mallory estate, fired after Emily's death. He'd claimed it was unrelated, said the estate was downsizing, but Father Brown remembered the whispers, that he'd been seen near the river the night the girl drowned, that he'd had words with Evelyn earlier that week, and most of all, that he'd vanished for a year after Emily died, only to return without explanation, living quietly at the edge of town. Father Brown paid him a visit. Miles was older now, slower, still limping. "I had nothing to do with that girl's death," he said, before a question was even asked. Father Brown said nothing, just looked at the shoes by the door. Mud still clung to them. "You went to her house." "I was invited," Miles said. "She called me. Said she wanted to talk about the past." "Did she tell you the truth?" Miles was quiet for a long time, then nodded. "She said she remembered everything, said Emily didn't slip, said she was pushed, and not by me." The rain tapped harder against the windows. Father Brown felt something shift. By who? Miles looked at him, face pale. By their father. And suddenly, the whole story cracked open. Evelyn had witnessed her sister's death, had seen her father push her, maybe not in rage, maybe in some warped panic, but push her nonetheless, and had been told to forget, threatened maybe, silenced. But memory doesn't stay buried forever, especially not in rain. That night, Father Brown returned to the church, and there, sitting in the third pew, was a man he hadn't seen in 10 years, Harold Mallory, Evelyn's father. He looked thinner, hollowed, but his eyes were sharp, watching. "You knew I'd come," Father Brown said. "She shouldn't have remembered," Harold replied. "She did. She told the storm before she told anyone else." And then Father Brown understood. Evelyn hadn't died because she remembered. She died because she finally told someone who couldn't let her live with that knowledge. And the killer hadn't run. He'd walked back home in the rain, knowing the water would hide everything. But it hadn't, because the rain, this time, had whispered the truth. Father Brown stood in silence for a long time, then said, "I know who did it." Harold didn't deny it. He simply closed his eyes and said, "But the truth will never be told." And outside, the storm began again. Chapter 8, He Lied When Rain Began. The moment the rain started, he changed his story, and Father Brown knew instantly that the killer hadn't run. He had simply begun telling a version of the truth designed to survive the storm, because only liars fear the rain. Honest men speak louder when it falls. But James Finley lowered his voice the second the clouds opened, and that silence became more incriminating than any scream. It started on a Thursday. The body of Marianne Leach was discovered in the garden behind Ashcroft Hall, face down in the soil with her hands still gripping her umbrella, as though she had been trying to protect herself from something far more dangerous than weather. The time of death was uncertain, but the gardener claimed he saw her just 20 minutes before the sky turned. That meant she was killed in broad daylight, and just minutes before the heavens broke open. Marianne was a teacher, unmarried, private. She'd lived in the village her entire life, but rarely spoke of her past. Most people believed she preferred books to people, but the day she died, she had sent a letter to the parish, addressed to Father Brown. 3 lines only. I have remembered. I must speak. Come before the rain. The letter arrived too late. Father Brown stood at the edge of the garden, eyes locked on the spot where her body had been. The constable's chalk outline had already faded. The umbrella remained, broken, torn along one seam. Unusual for a well-made thing, almost as if it had been slashed not by the storm, but by a blade. He bent down and found something odd, pressed into the soft earth, just beneath where her knee had fallen. A coin. Not just any coin, a half-crown, dated 1939, weather-worn, bent, and pierced through the center as if someone had once worn it as a pendant. The problem was, Father Brown recognized it. He had seen that very coin before, years ago, around the neck of a young girl who had gone missing in 1947. A case that was never solved. Her name was Clara Finley, James Finley's younger sister. When Father Brown mentioned the coin to James that evening, the man's expression was unreadable, calm, flat. Lots of coins like that, he said. Clara probably lost it years ago. You told me you buried it with her, Father Brown said. James blinked, too slowly. I was grieving. I said a lot of things back then. And what about now? Father Brown asked. The thunder cracked, the rain began, and James changed the subject. That was when Father Brown knew he had lied. Not just now, but then, and maybe always. The story of Clara Finley had haunted the village for decades. Disappeared one summer night. No body, no note, no suspect. Some believed she ran away. Others suspected foul play. But no one was ever charged. And James, her older brother, her guardian, had moved on. Or so it seemed. Until now. Because now, a woman who had been close to Clara at the time, Marianne, was dead, after claiming to have remembered something, and the very coin Clara had once worn was found beneath her lifeless hand. Too many coincidences, too much silence. Father Brown returned to the parish and searched the records. Clara had been listed as presumed deceased, but buried, no grave, no ceremony, no obituary, just vanished. He spoke to the old gravedigger, Thomas Bletchley, who had served the village for over 40 years. And Thomas, when asked about Clara, said something strange. I was told to dig, but I never filled the hole. What do you mean? It was ready for her, but she never came. Who told you to dig it? Thomas looked away. I was paid, cash, told to say nothing. And you never asked who it was for? I didn't need to, he muttered. I saw his boots. James Finley had lied for decades. The rain grew worse the next day, flooding gutters and soaking the chapel steps. That morning, Father Brown received an anonymous envelope. Inside, a single photograph, water-stained, of a child, Clara, wearing the same coin around her neck. But behind her, blurred and almost indistinct, was the silhouette of a man standing at the garden gate of Ashcroft Hall. Father Brown recognized the shape of the hat. James's father, a man who died just 3 days after Clara vanished. Official cause, heart failure. But rumors had always swirled about what went on inside the Finley home. Whispers of violence, of secrets. Father Brown returned to the Finley estate that evening. The house was silent. James sat in the study, fire lit, hands clasped. "She was never buried, was she?" Father Brown asked. James said nothing. "You didn't bury her, and you didn't lose the coin. You kept it, as a reminder, or as a shield." "She was my sister," James whispered. "I tried to protect her." "From whom?" He looked up, and finally spoke. "From our father." The confession cracked like lightning across the room. "He wasn't sick," James continued. "He didn't die of natural causes. He found out Clara was going to speak to someone about what he did. He beat her that night. She ran. I found her by the river. She begged me not to let him take her home." "And what did you do?" James trembled. "I hid her." "That changed everything." "You mean she lived?" "For a time." The silence that followed was unbearable. "Where?" Father Brown asked. James swallowed hard. "In the cellar of Ashcroft Hall. The place he would never look. I fed her, I protected her, but then one night, she disappeared." "And you didn't report it?" "I was 17. No one would have believed me. I thought she'd run. I thought maybe she drowned. But someone knew. Someone who had seen her there. Someone who had told Marianne. And now Marianne had died for it." Father Brown stood. "Who knew?" James hesitated, then whispered, "My father's mistress, Rosalind Grigg." She had worked at Ashcroft Hall for years. She had been there the night Clara vanished. And now she was missing. That night, the rain stopped, for the first time in 6 days, and when it did, the constable found her, body beneath the chapel arch, strangled. In her hand, a single page torn from a diary. "I saw him lead her to the cellar. I heard her crying for days. Then nothing. I should have said something then. No name, but no doubt. The killer wasn't James. The killer had already died. But the guilt hadn't. It had lived in silence. And the moment James began lying, again, the rain exposed it. The next morning, Father Brown stood alone in the graveyard. The rain had washed the soil clean, and beneath the yew tree he found a patch of earth slightly raised, too smooth, too fresh. He dug. Beneath it was a small wooden box. Inside, Clara's journal. Dated until 1951, 3 years after she disappeared. She had lived, and then she hadn't. Father Brown closed the box and whispered, "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told. Because sometimes the storm doesn't destroy the house. It just reveals who built it." Chapter 9. Only Rain heard the screams. By the time anyone opened the cellar door, the screaming had stopped, and the only witness left alive was the storm battering the roof above, as if it had tried to drown the truth just seconds too late. They found her sitting upright in the chair, mouth open in a final cry no one heard, eyes still wide with the image of her killer burned into the glassy stare of death. Her name was Margaret Bligh, and she had been trying to tell someone a secret so dangerous it cost her more than her voice. It cost her the silence she'd held for 21 years. It started with a knock on Father Brown's door at 4:30 in the morning, just as the first rumbles of thunder cracked over Kembleton. The message was urgent. No signature, just 6 words scratched into wet paper. "She's locked in. They know." It took him less than 10 minutes to arrive at Bligh House, soaked to the bone. The wind, howling like it too, had something to confess. The door was wide open. The lights were on, but no one was moving. He followed the sound of dripping to the cellar steps, and what he saw when he reached the bottom would remain with him longer than any prayer ever could. Margaret Bligh, the widow, recluse, and former opera singer, tied to a chair by silk scarves, blood at the base of her throat, and a gramophone still spinning beside her, the needle dragging in endless silence. No sign of a struggle, no forced entry, just her and the rain. It had started at exactly 3:47 a.m., according to the lightning recorder at the town observatory, and the coroner later determined she died at precisely 3:48, 1 minute, one scream, and only the rain had heard it. The villagers were stunned, but no one was surprised. Margaret had made enemies. Not with malice, she simply knew things about people's families, their pasts, the sort of things that don't get written down but still hang like dust in old curtains. She had once been loved, admired for her voice, her beauty, her brilliance. But something happened in 1933. Her final performance ended with a scandal no one would speak of. She vanished, retreated to Kembleton, and never sang again. Father Brown knew there was something buried in that silence, something deeper than shame, something darker than grief. He began at the scene. The gramophone, a strange selection, Ave Maria, but slowed unnaturally, as if the speed had been tampered with. On the floor beneath the table, he found a scrap of paper, torn from a journal, a list, names, some crossed out. 3 remained, in red ink: Edgar Moore, Celia Grange, Lionel Cobb. 3 names, no explanation. Father Brown started with Edgar, a solicitor, now retired, who once handled wills and estates for the Bly family. When asked if he had seen Margaret recently, his response was immediate. Number not for years. But his hesitation came too fast. His eyes flicked to the mantelpiece. A photo. Margaret, smiling, recent, less than a year old. She contacted you, Father Brown said gently. Edgar nodded reluctantly. She said she found something. A letter, hidden in the lining of her old tour coat, from her husband, dated before his death. She told you what it said. She said he was going to confess to a crime, but he died before he could. What crime? She didn't know. But Father Brown wasn't sure he believed that, because when someone like Margaret Bly keeps a letter for 20 years and then suddenly pulls it out just before her death, it means she was finally ready to speak, which meant someone else was ready to silence her. Celia Grange was next, Margaret's childhood friend. Now an invalid, she lived in the same room where she'd once hosted dinner parties for 20. Her voice trembled when Father Brown asked about the letter. She said it would change everything, Celia whispered, said it would ruin a man's name and save a girl who'd been forgotten. A girl? She never said who, but Father Brown suspected, because in 1933, a girl named Alice Pendry vanished after attending Margaret's final performance. Her body was never found, her name never cleared. She had been accused of theft, of Margaret's jewelry, a diamond brooch meant to fund her next tour. But the brooch had never turned up. Alice was last seen running into the storm that night. No one ever looked very hard. She was poor, unimportant, guilty by default. And now Margaret had found a letter that might have changed all of that. Lionel Cobb, the third. Name was harder to find, but Father Brown remembered the face. A stage manager, once blacklisted after an unexplained fire at a London theatre. The same fire that had ended Margaret's career. He found him living under a false name in a coastal village, working in a pawn shop. When asked about Margaret, his hands began to shake. She remembered, he said. Remembered what? That I saw it. The night Alice disappeared. I saw who really took the brooch. And who was it? Cobb looked away. She asked me not to say. Not yet. Said she needed to be sure. Said she'd confront him in person. Father Brown's breath caught. Who? But Cobb only wept. Back at the parish, another letter had arrived. Unmarked, unfolded, but Margaret's handwriting. It read, I've waited long enough. The truth must be spoken aloud, even if no one is listening. Tomorrow he will come to my house. I will ask him again, did you kill her? And if he lies, I will scream. It was dated the day before her death, which meant he had lied, and the rain had been the only one listening. Father Brown returned to the Bly cellar that night, after the police had left. The gramophone had been taken as evidence, but the bloodstain remained. In the corner of the room, half obscured by crates, he found a tape recorder. Old, but not ancient. It had recorded something. He pressed play. What he heard made his hands go cold. Margaret's voice, sharp and clear. Tell me what you did. A man's voice, low, shaking. You don't understand? I understand perfectly. You killed her, for that brooch. Silence. Then, she was going to ruin everything. I did what I had to do. And then, the unmistakable scream. Cut off, then static. Father Brown took the tape to the police, but by morning, it was gone. Someone had broken into the station, taken it. No fingerprints, only one thing left behind. The torn ribbon of the cassette, twisted like a noose. Father Brown stood in the church, alone, that evening. The storm had returned. Thunder rolled through the rafters. He looked up and said softly, I know who did it, then paused, and finished. But the truth will never be told, because only the rain heard the screams, and rain never testifies. Chapter 10. A killer watched from umbrella. The man with the umbrella didn't move when the body hit the cobblestones. He simply tilted the canopy ever so slightly to keep the blood from touching his shoes. The others screamed, scattered, called for help, but he just stood there, face hidden by shadow and drizzle, watching from the edge of the square, like a spectator at a play he'd already seen, performed in his mind 100 times. By the time anyone thought to question him, the umbrella was gone, and so was he. Her name was Caroline Esterly, a visiting pianist, young, brilliant, and in the final week of a whirlwind tour through the English countryside. She had played at St. Oswald's Cathedral just hours before her death, a haunting, flawless rendition of Chopin that left even the most hardened critics in tears. Then, as she stepped from the cathedral onto the rain-slick stones of the village square, she was pushed from behind. Head struck the edge of the fountain. No witnesses, no suspect, just the memory of the man with the umbrella. Father Brown was there that night. He had attended the concert, sat near the front. He remembered Caroline's hands, graceful and deliberate, and the peculiar moment after her final note when she froze, just for a breath, then looked out into the audience with something like recognition or fear. He hadn't noticed the man with the umbrella, but someone else had. A child, 11, named Jamie Thorne, claimed he saw the man standing by the statue during the entire performance. Not in the audience, outside, in the rain, not moving, just watching. And when the concert ended, Jamie swore he saw him walk away, not toward the exit, but toward Caroline. The police dismissed it. Children imagine things, especially in storms. Father Brown did not, because he'd seen something strange too. Caroline had worn a brooch that night, small, ivory, a swan in flight. It wasn't on her when she died, not in her coat, not in her dressing room. It had, vanished, like the umbrella. Back at the parish, Father Brown studied the program from the evening concert. At the bottom, in small print, was a dedication. For AF, you taught me what silence means. No one knew who AF was. Not her family, not her agent. But when Father Brown searched Caroline's old interviews, he found one article, an obscure music journal from 4 years ago, where she mentioned a teacher in her early life, a man named Alexander Fairfax. Fairfax had been arrested once. No charges filed. He disappeared not long after. But the dates aligned. He was her teacher, and she had tried to forget him. Until this tour. Father Brown tracked him down, not far, just 2 towns over, living under the name Albert Finch, retired. Quiet, too quiet. When Father Brown arrived at his door, he was greeted with silence, until the man stepped into the light. Tall, slender, holding an umbrella, black, plain, bone handle, no monogram, no maker's mark, just rain sliding off its edges, like secrets. You were at the cathedral, Father Brown said. Finch didn't answer. You watched her die. Still, silence. Then he smiled. Thin, empty. I watched her live, he said. And suddenly, Father Brown saw it. The obsession, the control. This wasn't about revenge or anger. It was about authorship. He hadn't come to kill her out of hatred. He had come to witness the end of his creation. She tried to free herself from you, Father Brown said. She dedicated her final piece to me. Finch replied. She dedicated her freedom to you, not her soul. Finch's eyes narrowed. Did you kill her? I didn't touch her, he said, stepping back. I simply watched. Father Brown left without a word, but the unease followed him home like a second shadow, because Finch was right. Legally, no evidence tied him to the crime, but emotionally, spiritually, he was tethered to it like a string pulled taut between predator and prey. Then the first reveal came. A girl stepped forward. Emily Gresh, 17, former student at Finch's private music school. She'd recognized Caroline at the concert, and something else, too. She mouthed something, Emily said. Right before she stepped outside, I could see her from the aisle. She looked straight at him and said, "Not again. Not again." Which meant this wasn't the first time she'd tried to escape him. It was the final time. The next day, the brooch was found, placed on the pulpit of St. Oswald's. No note, no prints, just the ivory swan, bleeding from one carved eye. Father Brown stared at it for nearly an hour, not in horror, in understanding. Because now the murder wasn't just symbolic, it was ritual. A farewell she had tried to control, but he had rewritten the ending. The final twist came when the janitor of the cathedral mentioned something odd. A journal, left behind in the dressing room, pages missing, and a final sentence scrawled in haste. He'll watch. He always does. But this time, I'll make sure the end is mine. Father Brown read it in silence, then looked up at the rain streaking the window panes. Because the killer hadn't used a knife. He'd used presence. She had fled her past, but he had followed, never speaking, just watching, waiting. And when she finally tried to take control, he let her fall and called it fate. Father Brown returned to the square. The fountain had been scrubbed clean, but he looked to the statue nearby, the one with the inscription about sight and blindness, and whispered, "I know who did it," then looked to the church door, still wet from the storm. But the truth will never be told. Because some murders aren't committed with hands. They're committed with umbrellas, and eyes, and silence. Chapter 11. Father Brown's rain-soaked revelation. He dropped the crucifix when he saw what was written in blood across the inside of the confessional. "You buried the wrong man." The words were smeared, half-washed by the leaking roof above, but they were unmistakable, and in that instant, Father Brown understood that the grave behind the church didn't hold a victim. It held a secret. Someone had spent 10 years trying to forget. The problem was, the rain hadn't forgotten anything. It had been raining for 6 days. Not a gentle drizzle, but a relentless downpour. A storm that seemed to be waiting for something to rise from the soaked earth. And on the 7th day, it did. The body. Not fresh, not recent, but unmistakably human. Found half exposed by the old well in the back field, just beyond the yew trees. A boy's skeleton. Arms crossed over his chest. And in one hand, a broken rosary, identical to the one Father Brown had given to Daniel Reese the night before he vanished 10 years ago. Daniel had been 16, a choir boy, sharp, quiet, eager to serve. The last anyone saw of him was the night of the Christmas Vigil in 1948. The case had never been solved. Most believed he ran away. Some whispered darker things, but Father Brown had never stopped praying for him. And now here he was, curled into the roots of a forgotten well, waiting for someone to ask the right question. The question came not from the constable, who looked like he wanted this to be an old accident, but from the letter Father Brown found slipped under the vestry door that morning. No name, no handwriting, just one line, written in red pencil. "What did you see that night?" That night, Christmas Eve. The same night Daniel vanished. The same night someone heard the organ playing after midnight, when no one was supposed to be inside the church. The same night Father Brown had walked out into the snow, certain he saw someone standing in the bell tower, though the stairs were locked. He went back to the tower now, 10 years later, the rusted key still in his desk drawer. At the top, beneath layers of bird droppings and broken beams, he found something impossible, a satchel, old, weathered, containing 3 things: a school notebook with Daniel's name on the inside, a small silver locket, and a page torn from the parish guest registry. One name circled: Arthur Penfold. Penfold had been a visiting deacon from York. Quiet, polite, soft-spoken. He'd helped with Christmas services that year, stayed only a week, left the morning after Daniel disappeared. No one questioned it. He was respectable, clerical, safe. But Father Brown remembered something about his eyes, the way he never looked directly at the children, only past them. He returned to the guest registry and compared signatures. Penfold's was different, too practiced, too careful, as if trying to remember what his own name was supposed to look like. Father Brown checked other records: the train manifest, lodging receipts, a different handwriting every time. And then he found it, buried in diocesan complaints, an anonymous report filed by another parish accusing Penfold of inappropriate proximity to choir boys. Nothing was done. The record vanished. But now the rain had brought Daniel back. Father Brown stood alone in the confessional, where the blood-written message had been left. He touched the old wood, still damp, and found something wedged in the hinge. A tooth, small, human. The break was unnatural, cracked at the root. A struggle had happened here, but who cleaned it? Who kept the church locked until morning? And why had no one said a word? He asked the sacristan, Mr. Elric, now old, nearly blind. Elric trembled. "I told them," he whispered. "I told them the door was open that night. But the bishop said, "Let it lie." Father Brown pressed him. "Elric, did you see Penfold leave?" "He never left." That stopped everything. "He stayed the night?" Elric shook his head. He never left the tower." "What do you mean?" "I saw him go up, but I never saw him come down." Which meant Penfold had vanished too. Or someone had made him vanish. Father Brown went to the well where Daniel was found. He knelt in the rain and whispered a name. Not Daniel's, Penfold's. And that's when he saw it. The second skeleton, a few feet deeper, crushed beneath stone, still wearing a clerical collar. 2 deaths, one buried by accident, the other buried on purpose, and the truth, hidden by silence, by fear, by the collar itself. The real question wasn't who killed Daniel. It was who tried to, and who stopped them. Because whoever killed Penfold had done it fast, violently, and never spoken again. The final piece came from an old letter found in Father Brown's own files, misfiled under baptism records. A letter Daniel wrote but never sent, addressed to M. He followed me. He said I owed him silence, but I don't. Not anymore. Tonight, I'll go to Father Brown. If I don't, look in the tower. And it was. Signed, Daniel. Father Brown stood in the pulpit that Sunday and looked out over his parish. One of them had known. One of them had seen. But none of them had spoken. He closed his Bible slowly and said only, I know who did it, but the truth will never be told. Then he looked at the crucifix and whispered, because in this storm, grace is the only shelter left. Chapter 12. Secrets washed down the drain. They only found the heart because it clogged the church drain during the 3rd hour of rain, rising up from the pipes as if even death couldn't keep it hidden anymore. And when Father Brown knelt beside it in the mud, staring into the organ of a body no one admitted was missing, he said only 3 words. It wasn't hers. The storm had been unrelenting for days, pounding the streets of Larksbridge with a fury that felt more like judgment than weather. And now it had returned, something someone thought would never be seen again. The heart belonged to a woman, but not the woman who had gone missing the week before. Emily Vane, schoolteacher, had been presumed to have run off, left a letter, left no trail. The police saw no foul play. But Father Brown had never trusted clean exits, and Emily's departure was too polished. Her room locked from the inside, her drawers emptied, but not dusted. A teacup still warm on the desk. People vanish, but they do not vanish neatly. And now, a heart with a bullet hole through the left ventricle had risen from the old drainage system beneath the chapel floor. A heart no longer attached to any name, no longer willing to stay quiet. The discovery was made by accident. The custodian, sweeping rainwater from the narthex steps, heard a gurgling sound in the drain. He thought it was a rat. It wasn't. It was a soft thud, followed by the rise of crimson water. At first no one believed it, but when they lifted the grate, the truth rose with it. The constable arrived within minutes, said it was probably animal. Sheep or pig, he muttered, washed in from the butcher's. But he wouldn't meet Father Brown's eyes when he said it, wouldn't step near the drain either, because deep down, everyone already felt what the air confirmed. Something human had gone missing, and something monstrous had returned. Father Brown traced the old drainage system beneath the church. It hadn't been used in years, not since the renovations. The grates fed into a series of tunnels once used by the monks to carry water from the crypts to the outer fields. He knew every inch of them. but he had never thought to look for secrets beneath the church floor. He followed the flow of rainwater backward, down stone corridors slick with moss and gilt, until he reached the point where the pipes split. One path led toward the cemetery, the other to the abandoned rectory, sealed since the fire 5 years ago, declared unstable, unsafe, unneeded. But someone had unsealed it. The lock was new, the door recently oiled. Inside, the rot was unbearable. Not the rot of wood or stone, the rot of silence, of something hidden too long. Beneath the old altar, in what used to be the rectory's wine cellar, he found what the storm hadn't yet touched. Bones, several of them, wrapped in oilcloth, dried, carefully placed, not buried. Each bone was marked with a ribbon, red, blue, white, ritual, but more than that, record-keeping. As if someone was keeping track, he called for help. Quietly, not the constable, not yet. He summoned Dr. Aldwin, the old physician, a man who knew when not to speak too soon. Aldwin confirmed what Father Brown already feared. The bones belonged to at least 3 different people, all women, all adults, all missing from Larksbridge over the past decade, all forgotten, and now all beneath the church. The next morning, the storm worsened, and a letter appeared on Father Brown's desk, typed, unmarked. I warned her, I warned them all, but they don't stop, not until they scream. And even then, it doesn't mean anything. Secrets die in sunlight, but rain remembers, rain hears, rain carries. You shouldn't have looked. Now it's your turn. He didn't show it to anyone, not yet, because there was something else bothering him. Emily's letter, the one she left behind, had been typed too. The same machine, the same font. Someone had written it for her, or more likely, after her. He examined the rectory again, this time more carefully. Under a broken floorboard near the hearth, he found the typewriter, still warm, and in the ribbon spool, the phrase, "Now it's your turn," used twice. One in the letter to Father Brown, one in the fake note left by Emily. The killer had a script, and now the story was shifting. He went to the school where Emily taught. Her desk was locked, but he had the key. Inside, he found a journal, half-finished, full of names, girls, women, notes beside each. Left town, married. Gone, but one entry stood out. Different handwriting, sloppier, angry. She knew, she remembered the cellar. She was going to tell Father Brown. I had to stop her. I had no choice. No name, but someone had used her journal as a confessional. And now they were circling him too. That night, he walked the tunnel again, rainwater pooling at his feet, and he found something he wasn't meant to see. A hatch, buried beneath mud and moss and broken tile, locked with a chain that wasn't rusted. Inside, a pit, just deep enough for a body, just shallow enough for guilt. He didn't climb down. He just stood there, rain soaking his collar, and whispered, I know who you are. And someone, watching, stepped back into the dark. The constable never arrived, because the constable had lied. He'd always lied. He wasn't there to solve anything. He was there to bury it. Emily had tried to expose him. So had the others. But secrets don't vanish. They flow downward, into drains, into walls, into memory. And when the rain came, they rose. Father Brown stood in the church that Sunday and gave no sermon. He simply looked at the pews, at the people, at the man in uniform whose hands were shaking. Then, at the pipe near the altar, still dripping, still bleeding, and said, I know who did it. Paused, then added, but the truth will never be told, because it was already spoken, by the water, and secrets don't drown. They wait.